For more than 3 decades, Johnny Carson welcomed America's biggest stars into living rooms across the country. Night after night, his calm voice, warm smile, and effortless humor made viewers feel safe, as if Hollywood itself were sitting beside them on the couch. But when the cameras stopped rolling, that comfort disappeared. According to those who knew him best, Carson carried something few viewers ever imagined: a private mental blacklist, a list of celebrities whose racial attitudes shocked even him, people he believed were quietly harmful to the country he loved. He remained the ultimate professional on air, but once the show cut to commercial, staff members recall a different man emerging. He'd lean toward Ed McMahon and whisper, a former Tonight Show producer later said. Sometimes he'd say, "That person just smiled at millions of Americans, and they don't think some of them deserve to exist." In his later years, Carson became more candid with close friends. The stories he told painted a disturbing picture: beloved icons whose carefully crafted public images concealed systematic discrimination, decisions that blocked careers, shaped the industry, and quietly erased people of color from the version of America shown on television. These were not just uncomfortable jokes or outdated language from another era. According to Carson, these were choices, deliberate actions, patterns of exclusion enforced by power. And what shocked him most wasn't always the obvious bigots. It was the names no one expected. That's why the first name on Carson's list stunned even longtime Tonight Show staff who believed they'd seen everything, because she seemed like the last person in Hollywood who would belong there. Number 9. Lucille Ball, the icon of progress. With invisible walls. When Lucille Ball appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences saw a television pioneer, the woman behind I Love Lucy, a producer who broke barriers for women in Hollywood, a star who famously fought CBS executives to keep her Cuban husband, Desi Arnaz, as her on-screen partner at a time when interracial marriage terrified network sponsors. Her career seemed to embody courage, progress, and boundary breaking. But what viewers didn't see was how tightly controlled that progress actually was. Despite her public battles with CBS, I Love Lucy remained entirely white throughout its 6-season run from 1951 to 1957. Not a single black family, not a recurring black character, not even a meaningful guest appearance. Production memos uncovered decades later revealed that in 1955, CBS quietly suggested an episode featuring a black family moving into Lucy and Ricky's neighborhood. Lucille Ball personally vetoed the idea. Writers' room documents show she rejected multiple scripts that featured black characters in anything beyond background roles. The contradiction became impossible to ignore in 1957, when legendary actress Ethel Waters was proposed as a guest star. Ball declined. According to staff present at the time, she cited audience comfort as the reason. Years later, Arnaz would acknowledge this tension in his autobiography with carefully chosen words. Lucy was progressive on some things and backward on others, a quiet admission of the contradiction at the heart of her legacy. Johnny Carson reportedly referenced that contradiction during private conversations in the 1970s, praising Ball's business brilliance while quietly noting her selective progressivism. Under her control, Desilu Studios hired very few minority writers or directors, even as industry pressure grew throughout the 1960s. Lucille Ball changed television forever for women, but for racial representation, her empire preserved exclusion. Her legacy revealed an uncomfortable truth. Even Hollywood pioneers could build revolutions that only applied to themselves. And if Ball represented passive exclusion, silence enforced by power, Carson's next name on the list revealed something more aggressive. A star who actively resisted integration while America was already changing. Number 8. Bing Crosby, America's golden voice behind closed doors. When Bing Crosby appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences heard comfort itself, the man who gave America White Christmas, the smooth baritone that felt like home during war, recession, and uncertainty. Crosby's public image was carefully polished, a devoted family man, an uncontroversial entertainer, a voice that soothed an anxious nation. For millions of Americans, he represented decency without edges, tradition without cruelty. But behind that carefully constructed persona, according to multiple sources cited by Johnny Carson and others who worked closely with him, was a man deeply resistant to integration and willing to use his power to stop it. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, even as the music industry slowly began integrating, Crosby maintained strictly all-white musical arrangements. When Decca Records suggested integrated recording sessions in 1953, Crosby reportedly issued a blunt ultimatum: remove the black musicians, or he would leave the label. This wasn't rumor. It became known within the industry. Jazz legend Louis Armstrong, who had once admired Crosby's talent, personally confronted him about the refusal to collaborate. Armstrong later documented the exchange in private letters, expressing disappointment in a fellow musician who had the influence to open doors, and chose instead to keep them shut. A 1954 incident at NBC became legendary among crew members. During a rehearsal, black backup singers were added to Crosby's arrangement without his prior approval. Crosby reportedly walked out mid-rehearsal and refused to return until the singers were removed and replaced with white performers. The message was unmistakable. In his memoir, Bob Hope later revealed that Crosby's old-fashioned attitudes caused persistent tension behind the scenes during their famous road pictures. What the audience perceived as playful camaraderie often masked uncomfortable realities off camera. Johnny Carson noticed Crosby's discomfort whenever conversations drifted toward civil rights or changing industry demographics. During a 1976 Tonight Show appearance, Crosby visibly shifted topics whenever integration was mentioned, his ease evaporating in real time. Studio documentation from Paramount Pictures further revealed that Crosby demanded separate craft services when minority crew members were present on set. It wasn't just ideology, it was daily enforcement. What made Crosby's behavior particularly damaging was how quietly it operated. No public outbursts, no notorious interviews, just steady resistance, enough to stall careers, block opportunities, and send a clear signal about who belonged. His wholesome image didn't just hide prejudice, it protected it. And while Crosby represented quiet segregation in music, Carson's next entry revealed something far more unsettling. A man publicly celebrated as a civil rights ally, who lived by different rules in private. Number 7. Frank Sinatra, Two Faces of the Chairman. On camera, Frank Sinatra appeared to be everything a civil rights ally should look like. He publicly championed Sammy Davis Jr. when Las Vegas showrooms were still segregated. He performed at fundraisers connected to the 1963 March on Washington. He voiced support for Martin Luther King Jr. when many stars stayed silent. His Rat Pack performances were among the few truly integrated shows on the Las Vegas Strip during an era when segregation was still quietly enforced. The public record painted Sinatra as progressive, courageous, on the right side of history. But according to multiple Tonight Show staff members, including Carson himself, a very different Sinatra emerged when the camera stopped. The contradiction was not subtle. Several crew members later documented hearing Sinatra use racial slurs in private settings, particularly during moments of anger or when he believed he was surrounded by people who would not challenge him. One backstage incident in 1971 became infamous among staff. During a heated political discussion that broke out during a commercial break, Sinatra reportedly referred to black protesters using a slur so blunt that the room fell silent. Everyone within earshot understood they had just seen something they were never meant to see. Carson later mentioned this moment during an off-air conversation in the early 1980s, an exchange later recounted by staff. He described Sinatra as a man who could be publicly generous toward civil rights causes, while privately capable of language that betrayed deep prejudice. Biographies written by members of Count Basie Orchestra support that account. Multiple musicians recalled Sinatra occasionally using offensive racial language backstage in Las Vegas, even as he performed integrated shows on stage and spoke publicly about equality. What made Sinatra's behavior especially troubling was not ignorance. He knew better. His public activism proved he understood the importance of civil rights. He understood how racism functioned, and yet he code-switched depending on his audience, ally in public, something far darker in private. A former Tonight Show producer later explained it this way: Johnny respected Frank's talent and even his civil rights record on paper. But he was deeply disturbed by the disconnect between public Frank and private Frank. That complexity bothered him more than outright bigotry. Carson reportedly told Ed McMahon, "Frank does the right things for the wrong reasons sometimes." Sinatra's legacy exposed a pattern that ran deep in Hollywood: performative progressivism, public allyship that looked righteous, and private behavior that preserved hierarchy. Donations and appearances on one hand, slurs and contempt on the other. It forced Carson to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some of Hollywood's loudest allies understood racism perfectly, and still chose when to ignore that understanding. And if Sinatra's contradiction was disturbing, the next name on Carson's list revealed something colder. A star who enforced racial hierarchy not just with words, but with contracts. Number 6, Joan Crawford, Hollywood royalty enforcing the line. When Joan Crawford appeared on The Tonight Show in 1970, audiences saw the image she had perfected over decades: impeccable posture, controlled elegance, the unshakable aura of old Hollywood royalty. She spoke with precision. She smiled with restraint. Every movement suggested discipline and power. But according to multiple Tonight Show staff members and documents later uncovered in the Warner Brothers archives, Crawford's off-camera behavior revealed a woman deeply committed to maintaining racial hierarchy, not just socially, but contractually. A writer reviewing studio records from the 1940s discovered a clause that appeared repeatedly in Crawford's contracts. It explicitly stated that she would not appear in scenes with colored performers in roles of equal status. This was not preference, it was policy. In 1952, production on Sudden Fear was delayed after Crawford objected to a black actor being cast as a dinner guest. According to internal correspondence, she demanded the script be rewritten so the character would appear as a servant instead, preserving the hierarchy she required both on-screen and off. Her demands extended beyond the camera. Crawford insisted on separate dressing room facilities whenever black performers were present, even if their scenes were filmed on different days. The message was unmistakable. Proximity itself was unacceptable. Dorothy Dandridge later documented Crawford's behavior in her autobiography. Despite both being contracted stars at Warner Brothers at the same time, Dandridge recalled Crawford's coldness, her refusal to speak, acknowledge, or even make eye contact in the studio commissary. The silence was deliberate. During Crawford's 1970 Tonight Show appearance, staff members noticed her visible discomfort when black musical guest Della Reese performed. During a commercial break, Crawford reportedly asked to use a different exit to avoid any backstage interaction. A former producer later said, "Joan maintained racial hierarchy even in casual moments. You could see her calculating who deserved her attention and who didn't." What made Crawford's behavior especially egregious was its persistence. This wasn't the 1930s. This wasn't early studio-era ignorance. She maintained these attitudes well into the 1970s, long after the Civil Rights Act had passed and long after the industry had begun, however slowly, to change. Carson later told colleagues that Crawford treated people as if the Civil Rights Act never happened. Her insistence on racial separation helped preserve Hollywood segregation, even as the country moved forward without her. She played powerful women on screen, survivors, fighters, icons, but off-screen, she enforced a system designed to keep others in their place. And while Crawford represented old Hollywood's rigid hierarchy clinging to power, Carson's next entry revealed something more unsettling still. A man who once marched for civil rights and later became something very different. Number 5, Charlton Heston. From the March to the Dog Whistle. When Charlton Heston appeared on The Tonight Show during the 1960s, he often referenced one moment with unmistakable pride: his participation in the 1963 March on Washington. There were photographs to prove it. Heston, marching alongside civil rights leaders, standing within sight of Martin Luther King Jr. during one of the most important demonstrations in American history. To viewers, Heston embodied moral authority, the man who played Moses, the hero who spoke about justice, dignity, and freedom, not just on screen, but in public life. For years, that image remained intact. But according to Carson and others who knew Heston across decades, something changed. The march in 1963 was real. Heston was there. He spoke about it proudly for years. Yet by the 1990s, his language and his worldview had hardened into something unrecognizable. In a 1997 Playboy interview, Heston stated that certain communities were not ready for full integration and needed to fix their culture before demanding equal treatment. He spoke repeatedly about the breakdown of the black family, framing racial inequality as a moral failure rather than a systemic one. To civil rights leaders, the shift was unmistakable. This wasn't neutrality, it was coded language. Heston placed responsibility on black Americans themselves, dismissing structural racism while invoking ideas that aligned closely with long-standing segregationist arguments. Carson, who had interviewed Heston multiple times over 3 decades, noticed the transformation immediately. A former Tonight Show director recalled, "In the 60s and 70s, Charlton talked about civil rights passionately. By the 90s, his tone was colder, defensive. It was like watching someone slowly reveal who they'd been all along." During a 1995 Tonight Show appearance, Carson reportedly observed Heston's noticeably different demeanor when a young black comedian was also booked on the program. The warmth and camaraderie Heston showed white guests simply wasn't there. By then, Heston had become a spokesman for the National Rifle Association, frequently using rhetoric about inner-city criminals and law and order that civil rights advocates immediately recognized as racial dog whistles, language designed to trigger fear without explicitly naming race. Heston never publicly reconciled the contradiction. The young man who marched with King, the older man who spoke about traditional values in ways that consistently targeted black communities. After Heston's final appearance, Carson reportedly told a producer, "That's not the same man who marched in '63. Or perhaps it was, and the country simply hadn't noticed yet. Heston's evolution raised an unsettling question. How many white liberals of the 1960s were sincere allies, and how many were only comfortable with justice until it demanded sacrifice? And if Heston's transformation was disturbing, Carson's next name revealed something even more jarring. A man who played America's conscience on screen while quietly opposing equality in real life. Number 4. Jimmy Stewart, America's conscience signed in ink. When Jimmy Stewart appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences saw the embodiment of American decency. The stuttering sincerity of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The quiet heroism of It's a Wonderful Life. A man who seemed to represent fairness, humility, and moral courage. For generations, Stewart was America's conscience. What audiences didn't know, and what Johnny Carson found deeply troubling, was how deliberately Stewart used his real-world influence to oppose racial integration while portraying heroes who fought injustice on screen. In 1957, Stewart signed a public petition opposing the integration of Los Angeles public schools. This wasn't a private belief shared among friends, it was a documented political action. He later hosted fundraisers at his Beverly Hills home for politicians who actively opposed civil rights legislation. Even more disturbing were revelations that emerged decades later through declassified Federal Bureau of Investigation files. According to those records, Stewart provided information to the Bureau about fellow actors who supported civil rights, labeling them potential communist sympathizers. To Stewart, advocating racial equality wasn't simply controversial, it was suspicious, un-American. In 1963, as Hollywood figures publicly voiced support for the Civil Rights Act, Stewart declined to make any statement at all. When colleagues encouraged him to speak out, he claimed he preferred to stay out of politics, despite having already used politics to oppose integration. Director Otto Preminger later revealed that Stewart initially resisted taking a role in Anatomy of a Murder, in part because the script featured a black judge. He eventually accepted the role for other reasons, but the hesitation spoke volumes. Writer James Baldwin documented meeting Stewart at a Hollywood party in 1964. Baldwin recalled the warmth Stewart showed white guests and the complete emotional shutdown when introduced to him. No hostility, just absence. Carson carefully avoided Stewart's politics during Tonight Show appearances. The image was too important, the illusion too valuable. But in private, Carson reportedly expressed disappointment that bordered on disbelief. A former producer recalled, "Johnny loved Jimmy's movies. He just couldn't reconcile them with who Jimmy actually was." Stewart's hometown of Indiana, Pennsylvania, later honored him with a museum. Letters archived there reveal his financial support for efforts to preserve community character, coded language long used to justify segregation. The man who played George Bailey, fighting for the little guy, actively supported the very structures that kept millions of Americans on the outside. And if Stewart's hypocrisy was painful, Carson's next entry was something else entirely. A man who didn't hide his beliefs, a man who said them out loud and faced no consequences. Number 3, John Wayne, America's hero, spoken without apology. When John Wayne appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences saw the ultimate American archetype, the Western hero, the war film icon, the embodiment of rugged masculinity, patriotism, and traditional values. Unlike many others on Johnny Carson's list, what separated John Wayne from the rest was chilling in its simplicity. He didn't hide his racism. He didn't soften it. He stated it openly and never apologized. In 1971, at the height of his fame, Wayne gave an interview to Playboy magazine that remains shocking even today. In plain language, he stated, "I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility." There was no ambiguity, no retraction, no clarification. In the same interview, Wayne defended the taking of land from Native Americans, arguing that they were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. The statements were published nationally, widely read, and followed by virtually no professional consequences. His career continued uninterrupted. Wayne remained one of Hollywood's most powerful box office draws, a fact that spoke volumes about what the industry was willing to tolerate and protect. Production records show Wayne actively campaigned against hiring black actors in leading roles. When he directed The Alamo in 1960, he rejected Sidney Poitier, despite Poitier being the most prominent black star of the era, casting a white actor instead. Wayne refused to work with black directors throughout his entire career, even as opportunities increased during the 1960s and 1970s. His Vietnam War activism was frequently laced with racial rhetoric. He publicly suggested that black anti-war protesters were un-American and lacked loyalty to the country. In a 1968 interview, Wayne went even further, stating that certain races were not suited for democracy and required strong guidance, language indistinguishable from colonial justifications for oppression. The 1973 Academy Awards provided a moment that crystallized Wayne's beliefs. When Marlon Brando sent Sachin Littlefeather to reject his Oscar and protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans, Wayne was reportedly enraged. Security personnel later confirmed they had to physically restrain him from confronting Littlefeather backstage. Carson's 1974 Tonight Show interview with Wayne became legendary among staff for its visible discomfort. Wayne defended his Playboy comments on air, insisting he was simply being honest. As the interview progressed, Carson's questions grew shorter, colder, less engaged. Viewers sensed the tension, even if they didn't yet understand why. Letters Wayne wrote to newspaper editors, now archived at University of Southern California, confirmed that his racial views remained consistent throughout his life. Even in interviews shortly before his death in 1979, Wayne never renounced his statements. A former Tonight Show producer later recalled, "Johnny stayed professional, but afterward he told us, 'I can't believe America's hero actually believes that.'" John Wayne proved something Carson never forgot. Hollywood didn't just tolerate racism, it rewarded it, as long as it came wrapped in patriotism. And if Wayne's openness was horrifying, Carson's next revelation cut even deeper, because it involved someone audiences believed was different, a friend, a Rat Pack icon, a man whose smile hid rigid boundaries. Number 2, Dean Martin, the cool king and the lines he wouldn't cross. When Dean Martin appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences saw effortless cool, the smooth crooner, the relaxed comedian, the Rat Pack icon who made everything look easy. especially friendship. On stage and on screen, Martin's association with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. appeared to symbolize a new integrated Hollywood, talent over color, brotherhood over barriers. But according to Carson, that image concealed rigid limits Martin refused to cross. The Dean Martin Show ran from 1965 to 1974, producing 264 episodes during a period when American television was slowly and cautiously integrating. Across all those episodes, there was one striking constant. Dean Martin never had a single black guest host. Black performers appeared, yes, Nat King Cole, Diahann Carroll, Sammy Davis Jr., but always within carefully controlled boundaries. They could sing, they could perform, but they did not sit on the couch as equals. Production staff later confirmed that Martin refused to perform comedy sketches with black entertainers as peers. Musical numbers were acceptable. Comedy, the heart of the show, where power and equality were displayed, was not. The situation with Sammy Davis Jr. was especially revealing. Despite their public image as close friends and fellow Rat Pack members, Davis was never invited into Martin's signature barroom sketches, the informal segments where Martin joked, drank, and bonded with guests. Even friendship, it seemed, had limits. A 1968 NBC meeting became infamous after its minutes were released years later. When executives discussed mandating integrated comedy segments, Martin reportedly threatened to quit the show. According to those present, his words were blunt. "I don't do comedy with colored performers. They can sing. The comedy is mine." The network backed down. Losing Martin wasn't an option. Carson later revealed, in a private 1982 conversation leaked by a staff member, that Martin once told him, "Black comedians don't have the right rhythm for my show." Everyone who heard it understood what rhythm really meant. Multiple Las Vegas performers later confirmed that Martin's dressing room was whites only by personal preference, even in venues that had officially integrated. Frank Sinatra, for all his contradictions, reportedly had to intervene repeatedly to convince Martin to perform at integrated shows on the Strip during the 1960s. Martin resisted even symbolic integration. After Martin's death in 1995, his children acknowledged his limited worldview in carefully diplomatic language, an attempt to contextualize without confronting. The contrast with his longtime comedy partner Jerry Lewis was stark. Lewis openly supported civil rights, and in his memoir, he suggested that deep disagreements over racial politics contributed to their 1956 split. The most significant moment came later. In a 1998 interview with CBS, Johnny Carson did something almost unheard of. He broke late-night television's code of silence, even after death. "Dean had racial attitudes that would shock people today," Carson said. "We all knew it in the industry. Nobody talked about it publicly. I'm talking about it now." Carson detailed Martin's discomfort with integrated performances, his preference for segregated audience arrangements, and his refusal to socialize with black performers off stage, even when they had just shared a spotlight. The revelation wasn't just about Dean Martin, it was about the system that protected him. And while Martin's exclusion operated through personal preference and star power, the final name on Carson's list represented something far more damaging. Not individual prejudice, but institutional design. A man who shaped childhood itself. Number 1. Walt Disney. The kingdom built on invisible walls. When the name Walt Disney was mentioned on The Tonight Show, it was always with reverence. The visionary, the architect of American childhood, the man whose name became synonymous with magic, innocence, and family values. For generations, Disney wasn't just an entertainer. He was a cultural architect. His characters shaped imagination. His stories defined morality. His parks promised happiness itself. What Johnny Carson and others inside Hollywood knew, but almost never discussed publicly, was that Disney built the most powerful family entertainment empire in history on systematic racial exclusion. Not accidentally, not casually, deliberately. The employment records tell the story with chilling clarity. From the founding of Disney Studios in 1923 until 1965, a span of 42 years, the company employed 0 black animators, not one. This wasn't oversight. A company memo from 1938, later uncovered in studio archives, explicitly stated a no-colored hiring policy for creative positions. For over 4 decades, across hundreds of animated shorts and feature films, Disney ensured that black artists were excluded from shaping the stories millions of children consumed. In 1946, Disney personally approved Song of the South, despite vocal objections from the NAACP. The film presented enslaved black characters as content, loyal, and nostalgic for plantation life, a romanticized fantasy released just 1 year after World War II. NAACP chapters picketed premieres nationwide. Disney dismissed the protests as political and accused critics of missing the warmth of the story. When Disneyland opened in 1955, employment contracts specified white applicants only for customer-facing roles: ride operators, performers, retail staff. The policy was enforced quietly but consistently, creating an entirely white public face for what was marketed as the happiest place on earth. In 1956, after external pressure mounted, Disney hired Floyd Norman, the company's first black animator. In his memoir, Norman described years of isolation, slurs from co-workers, eating lunch alone because no one would sit with him, exclusion from creative meetings despite his job title. Disney was aware of Norman's treatment. He never intervened. In 1967, Disney personally approved The Jungle Book, which included racial coding that audiences immediately recognized. King Louie, the jazz scat singing orangutan, was framed as an animal longing to be human, using musical styles associated with black culture to signal inferiority through metaphor. Internal marketing documents later revealed that Disney deliberately avoided advertising in black media outlets, instead targeting white family audiences exclusively. Multiple documented incidents during Disneyland's early years show black families being turned away under false pretenses, only to watch white families admitted moments later. One 1963 lawsuit stemmed directly from such an incident. Carson never confronted Disney publicly. The brand was too powerful, the advertising revenue too valuable, the cultural position too untouchable. But former Tonight Show staff recalled Carson's private reaction. "He'd just shake his head," one producer remembered. "Johnny knew the ugly truth behind the magic." The damage went far beyond Disney Studios. When you control children's entertainment, you control what children see as normal. Who belongs in adventure? Who gets to be the hero? Who is visible and who is erased? For generations of American children, Disney presented a world where people of color were invisible unless they were servants, caricatures, or coded animals longing to be civilized. As one former Tonight Show producer later put it, Johnny understood Disney's racism wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It taught kids who belonged without ever saying it out loud. The first black Disney princess wouldn't appear until 2009, 43 years after Walt Disney's death and 86 years after the company's founding. Disney proved something Carson never forgot. The most damaging racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it builds empires and teaches generations of children that exclusion is simply the way things are. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns, choices made by powerful people, protected by an industry that valued profit over accountability. Johnny Carson spent decades smiling beside these icons, but what he saw when the cameras stopped changed how he understood Hollywood itself. The public saw one version of these stars. Carson saw another. And when he finally chose to break the code of silence, he left behind a question that still lingers. Which revelation shocked you the most, and how many more were never written down?